Was New York's success really the result of hard work and ambition? Or did geography hand the city an advantage that no other American city could match? For 2 centuries, the story of New York has been told as a story of grit. Immigrants arriving with nothing, financiers taking risks, workers building skyscrapers block by block. All of that is true, but there's a piece of the story that rarely gets mentioned, and it has nothing to do with ambition. It has to do with rock, water, and a canal that changed the shape of American trade forever. Look at a map of the East Coast in 1800, and New York doesn't look special. Boston had deeper roots and a head start in shipping. Philadelphia was larger, wealthier, and more sophisticated, the actual capital of the country for a decade. Baltimore sat closer to the Chesapeake and the growing cotton trade. New Orleans controlled the mouth of the Mississippi, the artery draining half a continent. By almost every measure that mattered at the time, New York was not the obvious winner. So what changed? Start with the harbor itself. New York sits where the Hudson River meets the Atlantic in one of the finest natural harbors in the world. It's deep enough for large ships, sheltered from the worst ocean storms, and ice-free for most of the year, unlike Boston's harbor, which used to freeze hard enough to stall shipping for weeks. That alone gave New York an edge. But a good harbor wasn't rare. Plenty of cities had decent harbors. What New York had that almost nobody else did was a river that actually went somewhere useful. The Hudson is unusual. Most rivers near the coast run into hills or mountains within a few dozen miles and become useless for heavy shipping. The Hudson cuts through the Appalachians in a nearly flat valley, all the way up to Albany. That's a geological accident, carved out by an ancient sea and later by glaciers. And it meant ships and barges could travel deep inland without fighting rapids or steep elevation changes. Boston never had this. Philadelphia's rivers hit the fall line and stopped being navigable. New York's did not. Still, a flat river valley only gets you to Albany. Beyond that lies the real prize: the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the entire agricultural engine of the American interior. For that, you needed a way to connect the Hudson to Lake Erie. In 1817, New York State decided to build one. Critics called it Clinton's Folly, after Governor DeWitt Clinton, who pushed the project through. Digging a 363-mile canal by hand, through forests and swampland, with no federal funding, sounded like lunacy. It opened in 1825. The Erie Canal did something no one fully anticipated. It cut the cost of moving a ton of freight from Buffalo to New York City from around $100 to roughly $10. Shipping time dropped from weeks to days. Suddenly, grain grown in Ohio and Michigan had a cheap, fast route to the Atlantic, and from there to Europe. Almost overnight, New York became the funnel through which the entire American interior connected to global trade. Within 15 years, New York's port was handling more trade than Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore combined. Here's where it gets interesting, because this is where the other river cities started to lose. Philadelphia tried to compete by building its own canal system westward. The terrain fought back. Crossing the Allegheny Mountains required an elaborate system of inclined planes to haul canal boats over the ridge, and it never came close to matching the Erie Canal's simplicity or capacity. Baltimore bet on railroads instead, building the Baltimore and Ohio, one of the earliest major American rail lines. It helped, but by the time it was competitive, New York already controlled the flow of Midwestern grain, and railroads themselves increasingly ran through New York anyway, because that's where the money and the port already were. New Orleans is the strangest case, because on paper it should have won. The Mississippi drains an enormous share of the country, and before the canal era, huge volumes of Midwestern goods floated downriver to New Orleans rather than east. But shipping south meant a long ocean voyage back around Florida to reach East Coast or European markets. And New Orleans port dealt with silting yellow fever outbreaks and, later, the disruption of the Civil War. The Erie Canal offered a shorter, cheaper, more reliable path to the same European buyers. Trade patterns shifted north and east, and they never fully shifted back. So the freight started flowing through New York. But freight alone doesn't explain why New York became a financial capital rather than just a busy port. That part comes from what happens when a huge, reliable stream of commerce runs through one place for decades. Merchants handling that trade needed financing, insurance, and a way to manage payments across long distances. Banks set up near the docks. Insurance companies followed because insuring cargo ships was profitable and the ships were right there. The New York Stock Exchange, formalized in 1817 under the Buttonwood Agreement, grew alongside this trade, giving merchants and later industrialists a place to raise capital quickly. Financial institutions cluster where the money already moves, and by the mid-1800s, more money moved through New York than anywhere else in the country. There's a compounding effect here worth pausing on. Once banks and insurers and brokers were concentrated in one place, it became more efficient for the next bank or the next company to locate there too, simply because the expertise, the capital, and the connections already existed. Economists call this agglomeration. It's part of why Wall Street stayed Wall Street even after the original economic engine, the canal trade, had long since been overtaken by railroads and eventually by planes and container ships. The geographic advantage that started the cluster wasn't strictly necessary to keep it running. By the time the canal's importance faded in the late 1800s, New York's financial infrastructure was already self-sustaining. None of this means geography did all the work. New York's rise also depended on decisions that had nothing to do with rivers or harbors. State leaders chose to fund the Erie Canal, despite enormous skepticism and no help from Washington. Immigration policy and waves of arrivals from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and later around the world gave the city a labor force no other port could match at that scale. Legal and regulatory choices, including relatively business-friendly corporate law, made it easier to found companies and raise capital there than in many other states. Robert Moses's infrastructure projects in the 20th century, for better or worse, reshaped the region to keep pace with growth. Geography opened a door. People and policy walked through it again and again for 200 years. It's worth asking what might have happened without that geography. If the Hudson had hit mountains 50 miles upstream, the way most East Coast rivers do, there's no reason to think New York would have built the Erie Canal because there would have been nothing efficient to connect. Philadelphia or Baltimore might have found another route west, or trade might have stayed split between several mid-sized ports instead of concentrating in one place. We can't run that experiment, but the historical pattern is hard to ignore. Every city that tried to outcompete New York for Midwestern trade ran into a wall of terrain that New York simply didn't have. So was it geography or ambition? Probably neither one alone explains it. Geography gave New York a route that other cities structurally couldn't replicate, no matter how much capital or political will they threw at the problem. Ambition and policy decided what to do with that route once it existed. The Erie Canal wasn't inevitable. Someone had to gamble on digging it. But the flat valley it was dug through was there millions of years before anyone thought to use it. If geography made New York rich, could another American city ever replace it? Or was this advantage impossible to replicate?